The clock is already running out on the North American trade system, with the United States, Canada, and Mexico heading toward a July 1st review deadline that could expose the $2 trillion USMCA framework to a breakdown, just as tensions between President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney are hardening. If the agreement slips into open conflict or fails to hold, the fallout would hit a supply chain that underpins autos, energy, agriculture, and manufacturing across the continent. At stake is not a side deal or a symbolic handshake. The USMCA governs roughly $2 trillion in annual trade, making it one of the most important commercial arrangements in the world. And the review process now arriving has turned into a high-stakes test of whether Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City can keep the system intact instead of calm coordination. The process is colliding with political pressure, tariff threats, and a Trump-Carney confrontation that has already raised alarms among businesses watching for disruption. The July 1st deadline matters because it is the formal moment when the three countries are supposed to assess how the pact is working and decide whether to extend stability or let uncertainty creep in. That review was designed as a checkup, not a knife fight. But the current atmosphere has made it look more like a stress test for the entire North American economy. In practical terms, companies that move parts, raw materials, and finished goods across borders are now staring at the possibility that rules they rely on every day could become bargaining chips overnight. Trump's approach has added another layer of pressure, with trade policy increasingly tied to political leverage rather than routine diplomacy. Carney, who has positioned Canada as a defender of rules-based trade, is now confronting a White House that is signaling it wants more than compliance, it wants concessions. That leaves the USMCA in a dangerous middle zone where both sides are talking about preserving the agreement while simultaneously acting as if they are prepared to use it as a weapon for exporters, manufacturers, and investors. The problem is not just what happens on July 1st. It is the possibility that the review opens a longer period of instability, where every tariff threat, every public statement, and every negotiation becomes a market-moving event. In that environment, the real issue is no longer whether the USMCA exists on paper, but whether the political will exists to keep the North American trade machine from seizing up. Trump has escalated the trade fight with a new round of tariff threats, while U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has signaled that Washington is prepared to use the USMCA review as leverage. And Canada is already preparing retaliation across dairy, energy, streaming, and autos. The result is a pressure campaign, not a routine checkup, with both sides treating the July 1st review as a bargaining table, where the first move is punishment and the second is demand. Greer's message has been blunt. The administration wants results before it offers relief. In recent public remarks, he framed the review as a test of whether Canada and Mexico will make what Washington sees as meaningful adjustments rather than simply defend the status quo. Canada, for its part, is not sitting there like a passive extra in a tariff soap opera. Ottawa has already shown it is willing to answer in kind, using countermeasures aimed at politically sensitive sectors that matter to us exporters and lawmakers alike. Dairy is one of the flashpoints because the U.S. has long complained about Canada's supply management system, which limits access and keeps domestic prices protected. Trump has repeatedly attacked that framework as unfair, and his team has used it as a talking point to argue that Canada is not playing by the free trade script it likes to preach. From Ottawa's side, the system is a protected pillar of rural politics, which means any concession is not just technical. It is domestic fallout with a capital F. Energy is another pressure point, and this one hits harder because the North American market is deeply intertwined. Canadian crude, electricity, and pipeline flows are not side issues. They are part of the operating system for U.S. refineries, utilities, and industrial buyers. When tariffs or counter-tariffs enter that space, the damage is not symbolic. It shows up in costs, margins, and the kind of supply chain headaches companies love to pretend they can manage. Until invoices start landing, streaming and digital services have also entered the fight, which is where the whole thing starts to look less like trade policy and more like a culture war side quest. Canada has pushed for rules that force foreign platforms to contribute more to its media and cultural sectors, while Washington has argued that such measures can become disguised barriers to U.S. companies. In plain English, one side says cultural protection, the other side hears market access getting gaslit in real time. Autos remain the biggest economic landmine in the room. North American car production depends on parts crossing borders multiple times before a vehicle rolls off the line, and even a modest tariff shift can ripple through factories in Michigan, Ontario, and beyond. Industry groups have warned for years that tariff uncertainty can freeze investment decisions, and the current escalation is exactly the kind of chaos they were trying to avoid. Trump's tariff posture is also doing what it always does, forcing everyone else to react to Washington's timeline instead of their own, and that creates a negotiation environment where Canada is expected to absorb the threat, respond carefully, and then prove flexibility on U.S. terms. The White House, meanwhile, is signaling that a clean extension is not the point. The point is extracting concessions while the clock is still ticking. For businesses, the bigger problem is that the review is no longer being treated as a technical assessment of rules. It is being used as a political pressure tool, with dairy, energy, streaming, and autos all pulled into the same fight. Washington wants major concessions first. The collapse in trust between Washington and Ottawa has moved far beyond tariffs, with President Donald Trump repeatedly reviving his 51st state rhetoric and turning what was once a trade dispute into a sovereignty fight. In Canada, that language has landed as a direct challenge to national identity, while officials in Ottawa are working to contain the damage, defend autonomy, and reduce exposure to a U.S. market that is suddenly looking less reliable by the day. The diplomatic friction has also spilled into public, high-profile settings, including tense exchanges at Davos, where Canadian and U.S. officials have been forced to answer questions that would have sounded absurd in a normal year. Instead of talking about growth, supply chains, or regulatory alignment, the conversation keeps circling back to whether Washington sees Canada as a partner or a pawn. That shift matters because trust is the currency that makes trade deals work. And right now, that currency is getting gaslit in broad daylight. The economic fallout is already showing up in sectors far removed from the negotiating table. Canadian tourism operators have reported softer demand from U.S. travelers, while some businesses say the political noise is making cross-border planning harder and less predictable. The optics are not subtle. When leaders trade insults about annexation and dominance, consumers notice, and so do companies deciding where to spend, ship, and invest. Ottawa's response has been to lean harder into sovereignty language and less on the old assumption that the bilateral relationship will always self-correct. Canadian ministers have stressed that the country will not be bullied into accepting terms that weaken its policy space, and they have signaled a broader effort to diversify trade ties with Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The message is simple enough for any boardroom Karen in the room. Canada is not building its future around one customer anymore. That diversification push is not just political theater. Canadian officials have spent months expanding outreach on critical minerals, clean technology, energy, and agriculture, aiming to widen the country's export base and reduce the leverage Washington can apply in a dispute. The government's argument is that resilience now requires optionality, because depending too heavily on one partner has become a strategic liability, not a convenience. Business groups on both sides of the border are watching the tone shift with growing concern. For decades, the relationship was treated as stable enough to survive rough rhetoric. But Trump's repeated framing of Canada as subordinate has changed the conversation from policy disagreement to national insult. Once that happens, every negotiation gets heavier, every concession gets more expensive, and every pause starts to look like a test of strength. The larger problem for policymakers is that this is no longer just about tariffs, rules of origin, or market access. It is about whether the two countries still share a baseline assumption of mutual respect. And that assumption is now under serious strain. As one Canadian official put it privately, the issue is not whether the next round of talks will be hard, it is whether the relationship is still personal at all. The relationship is no longer personal. The Board of Peace snub landed first. Canadian officials had expected a role in the advisory framework being discussed around the ceasefire and reconstruction effort, but the final lineup left Ottawa outside the room. A move that diplomats described as more than a procedural slight. For Canada, the exclusion fed a familiar concern. Decisions affecting security and trade are being shaped without meaningful Canadian input, even when Canadian interests are directly on the line. At the same time, the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute turned a transportation issue into a political symbol. The bridge, a key cross-border artery for freight and commuters, has become a proxy fight over control, inspection authority, and who gets to set the rules when the two countries disagree. Canadian officials have argued that the latest U.S. posture would effectively give Washington leverage over a corridor that is critical to Ontario manufacturing and regional supply chains. Industry groups are already warning that even short disruptions could hit auto parts, agricultural shipments, and just-in-time inventory systems. The bridge handles thousands of commercial crossings in a normal week, and any slowdown ripples fast through both economies. This is not a local dispute anymore, one logistics executive said. It is a pressure point on the entire North American system. In POV terms, the bridge is no longer just a bridge. It is a bargaining chip. China has also entered the frame with its own warning, signaling that the widening North American dispute could complicate already fragile trade and security calculations in Asia. Chinese officials said the confrontation was another example of instability among major economies and cautioned against what they called politicized trade behavior. The warning matters because Ottawa has been trying to balance its reliance on the U.S. with a broader push into Asian markets. And Beijing is making clear that it is watching the U.S.-Canada fight as a test case. That creates a nasty little triangle. Canada wants diversification, China wants leverage, and Washington is making the bilateral relationship more volatile by the week. Analysts say the result is not simply diplomatic noise, it is a shifting map of risk for exporters, investors, and governments trying to read where the next shock will land. When the world's second and third largest trading relationships start looking unstable, everyone else starts pricing in the fallout. Inside Canada, the conflict is also stoking Alberta's separatist concerns, a development that federal officials had hoped to avoid while already juggling external pressure. Alberta's energy sector has long complained about federal policy, and the latest U.S. confrontation is giving separatist voices a new opening to argue that Ottawa cannot protect provincial interests in a hostile trade environment. The argument is simple enough. If the federal government cannot secure stable access to the U.S. market, why should provinces remain tied to its strategy? That line is resonating in some corners of the province, where frustration over pipelines, regulation, and revenue sharing has never fully gone away. It is not yet a mass movement, but it does not need to be to matter. Political scientists say separatist sentiment often rises when external pressure exposes internal fault lines, and this dispute is doing exactly that. The federal government now faces a two-front problem: defend Canada abroad while keeping the country from fraying at home. Then there is the Arctic, where military signaling has started to move in sync with the diplomatic breakdown. Article 34.7 now sits at the center of the dispute, and that is where the real legal fight begins. If the review process under the trade agreement fails, the parties are left with three possible outcomes: a negotiated fix, a formal panel ruling, or an escalation into retaliatory measures that could harden the split instead of resolving it. Each path carries different costs, but none of them restores the old assumption that the system will quietly absorb a political shock and move on. Under the agreement structure, Article 34.7 is supposed to function as a pressure valve, not a wrecking ball. It gives governments a procedural route to challenge conduct they believe violates the rules. But it also creates a paper trail that can lock both sides into positions they may not be able to walk back from without looking weak. That is the problem now. The more each capital frames the other side as acting in bad faith, the harder it becomes to use the process as a release mechanism instead of a weapon. The three review outcomes are straightforward on paper and messy in practice. The first is settlement, where one or both sides adjust the disputed measure and claim victory. The second is an adverse ruling, which would confirm that one side overstepped and force a choice between compliance and defiance. The third is stalemate, where the review produces no durable fix and the dispute simply rolls forward into the next round of tariffs, countermeasures, and political theater. That third outcome is the one officials are trying not to say out loud because it turns a legal review into a recurring crisis. Once that happens, every deadline becomes a bargaining chip. Every filing becomes a signal. And every technical objection starts carrying the weight of a broader trade war. In POV terms, the paperwork stops being paperwork and starts becoming the battlefield. The Supreme Court has already drawn a line that matters here. Justices have signaled that emergency tariff powers are not a blank check, especially when they are used as a substitute for normal trade procedure or as a way to impose pressure without clear statutory limits. The court's recent posture suggests that fast-moving executive action may survive only if it stays tied to a narrow legal basis, a defined emergency, and a record that can withstand review. That limit is not academic. If emergency tariffs are used too broadly, they invite judicial pushback, and if they are used too narrowly, they lose the leverage that made them attractive in the first place. The result is a trap of Washington's own making. The more aggressive the tariff strategy, the more it risks being boxed in by courts, the more restrained it becomes, the less it can force concessions. No outcome is painless anymore. And then there is the calendar, which is doing its own kind of damage. The 2036 countdown is not just a date on a chart. It is the point at which the current legal and political architecture must either be renewed, replaced, or allowed to expire into uncertainty. That means every fight now is also a fight over what the system will look like a decade from now and who gets to write the rules when the next review comes due. Trade lawyers say that long fuse is exactly why the current dispute is so dangerous. If the parties fail to stabilize the relationship now, they risk entering the next cycle with even less trust. Fewer off-ramps and a much shorter patience for procedural restraint. The legal clock is ticking, the political temperature is rising, and the system is already showing how brittle it becomes when both sides decide to the section. Rules are optional. The next few weeks will determine whether North America's trade architecture gets renewed, drifts into prolonged review, or starts to unwind. And each path carries a different bill for consumers, manufacturers, and investors. If the parties reach a stopgap renewal, they may buy time, but not trust. If the review drags on, businesses will keep delaying hiring, sourcing, and capital spending. If either side walks away from the process, the damage will spread fast through supply chains that were built to move on tight margins and tight schedules. Economists and trade attorneys say the first visible cost is not a headline tariff rate, but uncertainty, which forces companies to hedge, reroute shipments, and hold more inventory. That means higher financing costs, slower deliveries, and weaker pricing power for firms on both sides of the border. In practical terms, the longer the dispute stays alive, the more North American producers pay to do the same work, while competitors outside the region get a cleaner shot at market share. China stands to benefit from that kind of drift. As Washington and Ottawa spend political capital on legal filings, tariff threats, and public posturing, Beijing can keep presenting itself as the steadier commercial partner for countries looking to diversify away from North America's volatility. That does not mean China wins by default, but it does mean every month of friction gives it more room to sell, stability, absorb redirected trade, and deepen ties with firms that are tired of getting caught in a crossfire they did not create. The economic damage would not stop at trade balances. Automakers, agricultural exporters, energy firms, and retailers would all face higher compliance costs and more unpredictable access to the market, while smaller suppliers would have the least cushion and the fastest pain. According to trade consultants, once a cross-border contract gets rewritten for tariff risk, it rarely goes back to the old price, the old volume, or the old confidence level without someone taking a hit. That is why the political choice now is less about who gets the better soundbite and more about whether the region wants to preserve a system that still moves roughly $2 trillion in annual commerce. A renewal could be sold as a win by both capitals, but only if it comes with clearer rules and fewer loopholes that invite the next fight. A prolonged review would be the classic Washington and Ottawa compromise: enough process to avoid collapse, not enough clarity to restore certainty. A withdrawal or breakdown would be the hardest outcome to contain. It would invite retaliation, litigation, and emergency measures that could spill into autos, agriculture, digital services, and energy, while forcing companies to treat North America less like a single production zone and more like a set of separate risk markets. That is exactly the kind of fragmentation China and other rivals have been waiting for. Because every broken corridor opens a lane for someone else. For North America, the window for stability is narrowing by the day. The review can still end in a managed reset, but only if both sides stop treating the process like a reality show grudge match and start treating it like infrastructure. That actually matters. Otherwise, the region will spend the next cycle paying for delays, absorbing losses, and explaining to investors why the biggest trade bloc in the world could not keep